I will perhaps say a few reflections that are in line with the philosophy of our association, la Table Ronde de l'Architecture, the round table of architecture, about handwork. And I'd like to start by saying that our modern civilization separates the manual professions from the intellectual professions, the brain from the end. If you are an intellectual, it's normal to spend your life behind a computer, in an office surrounded by books. I'm afraid I have a few behind me, without the slightest contact with nature. And if, on the other hand, you are a manual worker, everything suggests that culture is not for you. And even if you feel the desire to immerse yourself in a book, you often don't have the time or the energy to read. So this division of labor actually emerged in modern Europe and is something to which we Westerners have gradually become accustomed. Two categories of people look at each other with lack of understanding and sometimes hostility, the manual workers and the intellectuals. This disconnect that runs through our societies is not a good thing. The estrangement between the manual and the intellectual creates frustration at both individual and social levels. For individuals, this amputation of the life of the mind, or this uprooting from the concrete reality of the world, represents suffering because they realize that they have become hemiplegic. At a social level, the separation of manual workers from the intellectuals creates resentment and class contempt. So why is this separation so harmful? Well, first, because it is not natural. From the outset, man has been Homo sapiens as well as Homo faber. Many of his intellectual faculties were developed through the use of tools. The French prehistorian André Leroi-Gourhan showed in his major book, Le geste et la parole, in English, the gesture and speech, that the development of human intelligence was made possible because prehistoric man stood up on his two legs, making his hands available for activities other than walking. And with their hands free, our ancestors began to fashion tools, weapons, bifacial splints, kitchen utensils, braided ropes, and so on. The region of the brain used to control gestures is close to the region of the brain used to speak. By developing their gestures through tool making, prehistoric man activated their ability to speak. And speech obviously opens up the world of the mind, the possibility of communicating, teaching children, reasoning, formulating abstract thoughts, and feeling empathy for our fellow creatures. So it is therefore gesture, concludes Leroi-Gourhan, that gives rise to speech, and speech in turn gives rise to the mind. So without the end, without the gesture, it is possible that man would have remained in a very backward phase of his development. So what about architecture? Well, architecture too suffers from the division of the labor that affects the rest of the society. This division emerged during the Renaissance, when the architect's profession broke away from the construction crafts to become an artistic profession in its own right. At the beginning of the 15th century, Brunelleschi wrote that the task of the trades was to carry out the architect's designs as faithfully as possible for the part for which they are responsible, without taking the slightest initiative. This way of building, in which the architect conceives the plans in the solitude of his genius, and the craftsmen are workers with no personality, deprived of the slightest margin of creative freedom, appeared during the Renaissance and has defined the profession of architect to this day. This conception of the architect's role is in complete contradiction with the medieval spirit, for example, where the master builder is called upon to design the building in its broad outline and then to withdraw and coordinate the work of the craftsman. A Gothic stone mason has the right to freely design minor ornamentation. Brunelleschi, on the other hand, went so far as to design the molds for the bricks used in the construction of the dome of Florence Cathedral. In the Quattrocento, the so-called architect became a brilliant but solitary artist. Today, the rift between the architect and manual workers is fully complete. The vast majority of architects know nothing about the building trades. They don't know the principles of carpentry, the stereotomy of stone, roofing, zinc work, or how to work with terracotta, lime, or plaster. How can you design traditional architecture if you don't know how it is built? This leads us to the following conclusion. Traditional architecture is not a matter of style or aesthetics, but rather a constructive science that has refined its processes over thousands of years. The aesthetic conception of architecture that led the 19th century, for example, to erect buildings that were magnificent but sometimes aberrant from a construction point of view, helped to propagate the belief that traditional architecture was no more than an aesthetic whim. In the 20th century, this gave its detractors the strength they need to organize its replacement by modernism, a form of architecture reputed to be rational and functionalist. So we could discuss this subject at length, but I'm aware that time is short, and I would like to say that the following conclusion. At the Table Ronde de l'Architecture, the Round Table of Architecture, we realized that the divorce between the architect and the craftsman was a central problem. We are therefore trying, through our summer schools, to reconcile architecture with crafts. Our students receive both architectural and craft training. Even if this course is short, and too short, it has the merit of existing, and what they learn in theory, our students also put into practice. When they learn Gothic geometry, they then receive manual training in bricklaying and stone stereotomy. When they learn about ornamentation, they also get their hands dirty by practicing plasterwork with a very talented master, none other than Patrick Webb. And when they learn about pitch roof, they also get to meet a roofer who explains the different materials and roofing methods. This approach, combining theory and practice, seems to us to be the only way to revive traditional architecture. This is the condition for architecture to once again become a genuine technical science that involves hundreds of trades and not an abstract and solitary aesthetic exercise. So I'll finish here, and thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening in case it's the evening for you.
Wow.